Squatsi Halpa, Dawasja Washrap, Wahindume Lee Francis, Washesh Kawekame, Medikaname. Good afternoon to all of you. I greet you in my traditional language, which is Keres, from the Pueblo of Laguna, which is 45 miles west of Albuquerque, New Mexico. My traditional name is Coach Winoshka, Lee Francis, my American name. And my family on my father's side is Kawek, or Kawekame, which is Laguna. And on my mother's side, Medicana, which is everything American. So I am thrilled to be able to be here today. And I'll begin with a story. It's a story about a young Indiginerd, a native guy who loved pop culture, video games, toys, and specifically comic books. Loved comic books so much that he took this journey throughout life and ended up getting a degree in education only to open a comic shop. That little guy's me, of course, obviously. As the head Indiginerd and the founder of Native Realities, the Indigenous ComicCon, and Red Planet Books and Comics, I've lived a life that really revolves around how we tell our stories using a different medium, using a pop culture medium. And this pop culture medium was very central to the way that I grew up. I remember one of my earliest memories of picking up comic books was at the spinner rack, where you could find all the comic books, at a place called Duran's Central Pharmacy. My father was a big science fiction fan, and he thought that any reading was good reading, so he allowed me to get any comic book that I wanted off the rack every weekend that we would go down to this restaurant. And this developed a love in me for reading. But also, I loved everything else in between. I loved science fiction like my father. I loved fantasy and playing Dungeons and Dragons. I loved video games. I was playing on a TRS-80 at age 4, and it has not stopped to this day. All of this great pop culture material just continued to develop in me. As I continued to grow up, I'd find myself at comic shops, locally or abroad, wherever I could travel, and I'd be checking out the toys and finding all the great new exciting things that would be there that would spark something for me. And it would spark this dreaming, this ability to be able to see superheroes, mythical worlds, and fantastic places. And it reminded me very much of my traditional stories, the stories my dad told me when I was growing up, stories of heroes, stories of star travelers, stories of monster slayers. And these stories wedded in me, and they combined with this pop culture and created this Indiginerd right here. Well, knowing how way leads unto way, I began a career in education, teaching at my home reservation at the Pueblo of Laguna, Laguna Acoma High School and Middle School. And as I was looking through the shelves, I noticed that there was a lot that was adult Native literature or a little bit for young high school students, but there wasn't anything comic book related. And if it was very non-representational. And we've spoken a lot about representation, but it didn't occur to me that all the superheroes I had seen growing up never really looked like me. And even the superheroes that were being presented at the time for my students didn't really look like them. Pueblo people, as my dad likes to say, are round and brown. We don't have the fine physique that you see in all of the westerns and the gunslinging for all of my northern brothers and sisters. We don't ride a lot of horses. We plant corn. We're garden desert people. So for me, I wanted to make sure that my kids got to see themselves represented in popular media, and especially in comic books and graphic novels, games, toys, and collectibles. It was very important for me that that took place. So in 2014, after getting my PhD in education, I started a comic book publishing company called Native Realities. And the idea behind it was to be able to create Indigenous-centric, by, for, and about Native people, to give a chance for us to be able to create our own superheroes and our own visual media that was only dependent upon how we wanted to be able to create and portray ourselves. Because throughout history, we have not had the chance to portray that. For 400 years, we have been dominated by Western pop culture mentalities that have created this mythology around Native American identity. It is usually associated with the plains, but it can often be an amalgam of the Southwest and the East Coast and the coastal folks that stretch from sea to shining sea. And this, what we call an amalgam Indian, creates this reflection in pop culture that is a mythology. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist for my students. It didn't exist for me. But that's been changing. And not only from the work that we've done when we started in 2014, but from all of these amazing creatives that are now starting to create their own comics, their own games, their own toys, and their own collectibles. And this is why I think the idea of coming back to this idea of indigeneity and what pop culture is and how important it is, because it is very, very imperceptible. The amount of media that you see and that you're bombarded with, especially as a young person, all the time, it permeates the brain. And that pop culture just repeats and cycles in and over itself. And soon the reflections that have been forced upon you become the reflections that you take on for yourself. And it's a bit insidious, because one of the ways in which we have seen Native people have to contend with colonization has not only been with the taking of land or the taking of language, but I think one of the most disastrous or difficult parts, it's the taking of the imagination. And so when I founded the company, the idea was that we would be able to spark and unleash the indigenous imagination through comic books, through role-playing games, through popular culture. 2 years after founding Native Realities, we started the Indigenous ComicCon. It was a way for Native people in science fiction and fantasy and video games and pop culture and movies and television and, of course, comic books to all get together, to be there on our own terms, about our own cultural identities, which had a lot more to do with being a nerd than it had to do with being out there in this amalgam Indian space. We had cosplayers that dressed up like their favorite characters, native and non-native. We had people making wonderful toys and a new type of crafting. This is Legos, by the way. And because of that, we found ourselves needing to continue this work. So I founded the Red Planet Books and Comics, which is still the only Native comic shop in the world, where we feature the majority of Native comics that you can find in the United States, as well as abroad. We have wonderful connections and wonderful partners, and we keep bringing more and more work and media and materials into this space. And it's desperately needed. For 400 years, and throughout that time, America, we've gone through 4 periods in history. We started with the noble savage, moved on to the vanishing Indian, and then it was the Red Devil, the villain in all the Westerns. And finally, coming back to what we call the tragic chief, person that has to give up their own culture and tradition to be assimilated into Western society. Now, we see that a lot in the histories. But what comic books and pop culture media allow us to do is to think beyond that. We get to be able to create new worlds and craft them right there in front of us. We can create a world where colonization didn't happen. And America, or Native America, becomes similar to Wakanda. And there's a game out there like that. It's called Coyote and Crow by Connor Alexander. And it features a time when this didn't happen. And the Americas become this technological and cultural center of the world. And you get to play in that world because it's a role-playing game. You can look at a comic book, something like Six Killer, which is the comic book that I write, that unleashes the imagination around the issues of missing murdered Indigenous women, and how a young woman is seeking to solve the mystery and find her sister's killer. All of these things are critical in repealing that misrepresentation and taking ownership for our own imagery. And using comic books, more than anything, allows us to wed the imagery with the words and the text in these fantastical worlds that we can only dream of. Because sparking that indigenous imagination is central. It's key and critical to everything we do. It allows us to be able to create those kinds of worlds, because if we can imagine it, if we can dream it, we can achieve it. That's what our ancestors taught us. We were charting the stars long before we saw these maps. We were charting the earth long before all of the geographies and the technologies that abound now. We had those in our indigenous ways, and we passed them on through our stories. These ways of being and knowing are embedded in these spaces. I remember I took a trip to Azerbaijan many years ago, and we got to look at petroglyphs. And this is shortly after I founded the company. And I realized that we had been making comic books since time immemorial. Our stone stories are comic books. We put them in a permanent medium so that they would pass on for generations. They hearken back to who we are, for all that we are, and all the culture that we bring with us to this very day. And now we see all of these comic book makers. The first comic book, Native American-centric comic book was created in 1984. It took another 10 years till 1994 when the second one was created. That was John Proudstar's Tribal Force. It took another 10 years until we saw Aragon Starr's Super Indian and Jay Ochik's The Raven. But within the last 5 years, not even just from our company, we have seen 20 to 30 new comic books arriving. All because we are choosing to tell our own stories. And ultimately, we are choosing to be the superheroes of our own stories. When you get to see yourself as a superhero, it's one of the most amazing things. I remember one of the students picking up a book about the heroes, and these heroes are all super actiony. They look so great, and they're buff, and then the hero twins, and they have all the things. They look amazing, right? In comic book style. This young man is in my comic shop, and he's paging through, and he has this look of delight, because I know that feeling. It's the first time that you get to see yourself embodied as that hero. And he begins to imagine that he can also be that hero. And this is similar to the experience that I had the first time I heard a hero story that my dad passed on to me, one of our traditional stories about our heroes and how they saved the people, how their job was to take care of and protect the people. And the comic books that we create are about saving the people. The video games that we are looking at are about taking care of the people, all of the people, the world over. And I think that's why I love being an Indiginerd. I get the chance to live in this world, not only one that I'm making, not only this fantastical world that I get to exist in, but the one where I get to see young people coming into my comic shop looking around in wonder at a place that they have never seen before in any other comic shop, and where the shelves are filled with books that look like them. And I finally get to fill that one goal that I wanted to when I started teaching, which was to be able to fill that shelves for my students so that they could have that same wonderful delight of being a nerd just like me. And hopefully, as we continue forward with this, and we find ways to continue to use incredible mediums to tell our stories, to bring forth our knowledge, to capture it in a way that combines imagery with narrative. As we continue to do this, we can continue to inspire so that all of our young people and all of our communities believe that they can accomplish anything. We re-spark that imagination so that they can continue to be space rangers or monster slayers or superheroes. And with that, I hope you all go out, find another comic, read it, play that video game, be that role player, and achieve those dreams. Be the superhero of your stories. Tawae. Thank you.